the Congress Party is that it is a personal fiefdom. That it was essentially, at some points, running India as kind of a one-party state. So as ugly as the BJP is, I think it was possible in the 1990s and the early aughts to talk about it as being sort of a positive, part of a positive trend among many large democracies.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm the producer, Rory McElhone, and helping us dissect the world of politics is, as always, Robert Morris.
How's it going, Rory?
A wee bit grumpy. Today's been a car-themed day. I'm getting my car fixed because I didn't pass a certain examination. I then had to get different insurance because insurance premiums have gone way up. And I tried to tax it and they says I needed the certificate that I've failed that I'm trying to get fixed. So I was a bit grumpy at that. But apart from that, today's been grand. How have you been?
I'm okay. I'm in paradise. I'm in northern Michigan, which makes me very happy. It's the lake is just warm enough to swim in if you've got a special cap, and that's just about perfect as far as I'm concerned. My sort of cold plunge workouts make me very happy. So good to be here.
That's good to hear. So you're happy with the temperature? It's not gone so hot that you worry a large number of your population will die?
No, that is not a concern in northern Michigan, nor is it likely to be in my lifetime. But it is a problem in a country that I'd like to talk about today, which would be India.
Just to give an idea of the heat, this just terrifies me as someone that thought Boston was too warm. They seem to be getting temperatures above 50 degrees, which is 50 degrees Celsius, which is 122 Fahrenheit. That's just terrifying, Rob.
Yeah, I saw an amazing article talking about how Amazon was keeping its workers in its warehouse working at those temperatures.
Oh my God. Oh, their warehouse in India?
Yeah.
Oh
Amazon's
goodness.
doing a big push into India. Actually, it's good that we're starting off with something rather doomy and threatening, because I think this is going to be one of those, wait for it, one of those rare things, Rory, which is kind of a hopeful and positive podcast episode.
Brilliant.
Talking about some really good news.
1 in 10 is optimistic.
Yeah, 1 in 10. Surprisingly good news. And what we're going to be talking about primarily is the Indian elections. Neither of us pretend on any level to have anywhere near adequate understanding of India. It is tremendously complex.
As I said, it's more like a continent. Like each of these states, their histories go back hundreds of years, and it's just such an incredible place. So even I think even experts might even not have enough information. You could just have every podcast about India.
India is its own world. Like when we talk about the Middle East, like I'm usually pretty confident in saying we're doing a better job than any U.S. cable news channel, intermittently better than most print journalism in the United States as well, because I've read like 5 or 6 books on the region of the country. It takes that little to do a better job. I've read 5 to 10 books on India, Indian history, what have you, and I am still completely at sea. And I just want to say that I am sure, what we've said so far and what we're going to say going forward is just replete with errors. But, I mean, just the fact that the Indian elections take place and have regularly taken place for half a century at this point.
Also, this
more
is
than
the
half a
year of
century.
Democracy. Everyone seems to be voting.
Yeah, a lot of votes.
The EU just had their votes in. The Republic of Ireland had local votes. The UK is doing votes. America's voting. India's just voted. And I'm sure there's a whole smorgasbord of others.
There's a lot going on. But just the fact that the size and continuity of Indian democracy, 1.4 billion people voting, it's such a massive logistical task that it doesn't take place on a single day. It takes place over the course of 6 or 7 weeks. So from April 19th until June 1st, these folks voted, and the results were tallied and released on June 4th.
But what's impressive is that it does seem to be, it's considered a flawed democracy, but it's not too far behind what America is, according to The Economist. They're both at 7 point something. So this is a proper election with, proper results.
Well, that's exactly it. In a country that it's certainly making economic strides, but is and has been much poorer than the United States, than all the functional democracies in Europe and North Asia. And yet they've managed to continue to have this relatively unbroken, Indira Gandhi, might have mussed things up there a bit in the 1980s, the 70s and 80s, but largely unbroken history of democratic elections. And what's so exciting, what is good news today, is that in a surprise, sort of a surprising upset, India's democracy was confirmed. India's prime minister, who's been in power since 2014, was expected to win a commanding victory in these elections. And Modi, like Erdogan or Orban or Putin, is included in this overarching concept of a populist slump towards autocracy or declining democracy everywhere. And this can be a little confusing to U.S. voters because after this election, Modi is still, I'm not sure if the negotiations are finished, but still vastly more likely to be the prime minister of India. I don't know if that's already been confirmed. But regardless, this election, despite the fact that it leaves him in power, is seen as a shocking disaster.
Well, he is wounded, I would say.
Yeah, a shocking disaster for Prime Minister Modi and his party, the BJP. And we'll tease that out a little bit more. But it's incredibly heartening. And in a electoral context, well, certainly the United States, no matter what the result, the United States is not going to provide any support for the idea of democracy this year.
Wow.
Whether Trump or Biden ends up as winning, even at this point, I'd still prefer Genocide Joe. But regardless of who wins, it's going to be either a catastrophe or just sort of a sad limp forward that is slightly less catastrophic. Whereas India has provided a truly shining, brilliant example of democracy and how it functions, and has proven itself to be an inspiration to us all, frankly.
But it also has a optimistic future. I've heard on the world markets, it's sell China, buy India.
Well, yeah, I think the initial reaction was, and I was planning on closing with that, is actually the opposite.
Oh.
There is, and I'd like to sort of work against that orthodoxy, but certainly you're right about the broader story. That is the broader story. What made the threat of Modi so pernicious is that he's this populist, hardcore nationalist, Hindu nationalist guy who also combined, this is a dynamic, somewhat very different, but somewhat similar to Erdogan in Turkey, combining this sort of hyper-nationalism and victimization of a minority group with, I guess Erdogan's fallen further away from this with the interest rates, but traditionally the pitch was, we're the pro-business guys. And Modi, the pitch was, we're the pro-business guys. And actually markets were expecting Modi to have this dominant victory, and the markets liked that, actually, because no matter how authoritarian or however bigoted Modi may be, he was seen as the guy who's going to put through the kinds of reforms that The Economist or Wall Street wants. So I think actually markets took a bit of a dive. I expect them to recover, but I think markets, on the initial news, markets were not so happy. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of why actually I think that may be a mistake. It's fascinating all around. Just to go into the details a little bit of what actually happened here. So on June 4th, we got these results. Modi was talking about getting 400 seats. So it's the Lok Sabha. I'm not entirely certain what that means, but I believe this is the lower house of the Indian legislature. This is a parliamentary system.
So you need 272 to have a, majority.
A majority. And in 2014, so yeah, it's 543 seats. In 2014, Modi got a slim majority of 282 seats. In 2019, 5 years later, went up 303 seats. I just remembering that 2019 election, there was a real press of democracy is on the ballot, and oh gosh, this is the only way to save we have to vote out Modi or Indian democracy is done. Really hard pressure here. And the Congress Party, the traditional elite party of India that had been pushed out further and further, really was just absolutely humiliated. So I think it was seen as even more of a India, even though the BJP only got 303 seats out of the 543 seats in the Indian context, where there are guaranteed to be all kinds, like dozens of parties that represent one jurisdiction and will always win that jurisdiction or what have you. What we saw was just a decimated opposition. You just had the BJP, Modi's party, and then a bunch of little parties and a humiliated opposition.
Because the BJP is an alliance itself, isn't it?
Well, the BJP is, I think, its own distinct party, but then, yes, there's a larger alliance that it's part of. So this is why, that larger alliance is why. So now, fast forward to 2024, when Modi was talking about, everyone was expecting, international markets were expecting them to go from 303 seats up to 400 seats.
And their own internal polling suggested the same.
Yeah. They got 240 seats, falling below that 280 majority that they need. But because of that alliance that you're talking about, Modi will be prime minister again because of beyond the 240 seats that the BJP got. There are other parties that are sort of naturally affiliated with them. And there have been some negotiations that they've had to make to put together that coalition.
I've heard a funny thing that happened is that the BJP were like bribing and poaching all the other talent from the other parties, which had the effect that they sort of soaked up all the corruption, which then meant the other parties, the only ones that were more pure and immune to corruption were left. So he's kind of like taken all the badness and made them better and more efficient. I thought was quite funny.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It is an interesting thing when a party has been as dominant as the BJ has been over the past decade and is expected to continue their dominance. And a lot of that is disintegrating this month, which is pretty inspiring to see and is pretty fantastic.
Because of the Indian National Development Inclusive Alliance, which is an acronym so wonderful you'd think the Americans had come up with it.
You'd think. Well, what's an interesting story here is the sort of rampaging return of Congress itself. I've made a lot of fun of Rahul Gandhi, the leader of the Congress Party. Interestingly, this was something that was a revelation to me. Perhaps everybody knows this, but the Gandhi family that traditionally runs the Congress Party has no relation to Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of Indian independence and great spiritual figure. Nowadays, more revered perhaps outside of India than he is within India. But that was just sort of an interesting thing for me, that actually the Gandhis that run the Congress Party today are not related.
Do they pretend to be, or is it just a common
I don't think
surname?
so. I don't know. Well, I mean, certainly in the U.S. context, it's a well-established joke that if you just have the same name, that somebody recognizes, even if you've got no relation to them. I think there's an Eddie Murphy film that took that as its. Eddie Murphy gets elected to Congress surprisingly because he has the same name as the guy who died. Or something like that. But that is a factor in electoral politics. But I don't think the Gandhi family pretends that they are related to the Mahatma.
Yeah, I think it's a much more just ordinary name in India.
So this is what's going on here. Frankly, is a pretty stunning story of democratic consolidation, and it might be worth talking about just a little bit of Indian electoral history to talk about that. It's nice to see, even within my lifetime or within my adulthood, seeing India evolve into a much more thriving system here. If you go back 15, 20 years, I think the BJP has always been kind of a grim kind of party. It is an insurgent party. It really, perhaps it's because I know Turkish politics so well, there are a lot of similar dynamics here. The AK party in Turkey, Erdogan's party, is a Islamist party for sure, but it also was legitimately, at least in its first decade in power, an insurgency against an old elite. Mm-hmm. And that is what the BJP is. Frankly, I think the BJP is a lot less attractive than the AK party's Islamists. And I am not someone who particularly has any particular love for Islamists. But the BJP party has deep roots in a pretty fundamental, I'm not sure if racism is the right word, but certainly religious bigotry, and certainly fervent nationalism and Hindu chauvinism. But it is also the political party that broke, possibly malign, stranglehold on power that the Indian National Congress had. Congress Party goes back to independence from the British. This was Mahatma Gandhi's party. It is very unattractive nature of it is that it's also does appear to be sort of the fiefdom of the Gandhi family. The Gandhi family is actually the descendants not of the Mahatma Gandhi, but of India's first prime minister, the somewhat patrician, and I will not attempt to pronounce his first name, but Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru. Nehru's daughter married Gandhi. And so this family has sort of used the national party of India as its private fiefdom for now, closing in on a century, which is very unattractive, frankly.
No, yes, it is.
However, the Congress Party, despite this personal fiefdom aspect, has in response to the BJP become, it had, going back to Nehru, it had more left, more social justice oriented aspects to it. Then of course, in the early aughts, it became the party of neoliberalism under Manmohan Singh. I apologize for the pronunciation there. It's what's ugly about the Congress Party is that it is a personal fiefdom. It was essentially at some points running India as kind of a one-party state. So as ugly as the BJP is, I think it was possible in the 1990s and the early aughts to talk about it as being sort of part of a positive trend among many large democracies.
A step in the right direction.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. So Mexico in 2000 finally had a party in power other than the PRI, Partido Revolucionario Institucional, that had literally run the country. Mexico had functioning elections, but all within a one party from 1920s to 2000. Japan was always run by one political party up until, I think, briefly losing power in the 1990s, and then I think actually finally losing majorities in parliament in the 2000s. So it's sort of part of this, frankly, positive dynamic of old, like, one-party type approaches to democracy that raised questions of like, okay, like, is Japan really a democracy? Is Mexico really a democracy if it's just been run by one party for decades upon decades? So the BJP was initially part of a positive dynamic in breaking this one-party monopoly of a party that the Indian National Congress that was essentially the property of a single family. And I think that we see that in Turkey as well. The AK party, broke. Well, of course, it wasn't just one party because the military would come in every decade or so in Turkey and a new crop of parties, but it was one elite that was sort of broken by the AK party. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people expected the BJP, especially after these past two terms with Modi in power, expected the BJP to continue to control power in a really progressively less democratic, progressively more authoritarian way. And that appears to not be the case, which is tremendously exciting.
Are you impressed that the BJP is able to control India and keep it so coherent? Because there seemed to be a talk that, a country like China is doing so much better and a lot of these democratic countries should be more authoritarian like China. Is it impressive that you're able to essentially not fully unite, but work with 1 billion people? Like, this is an outstanding achievement, is it not?
Of course. Well, it was, as I said at the beginning, just the fact that India has largely functioned as a democracy since 1947 with that little Indira Gandhi break in there in the 70s or 80s.
But it's very federal, but it's, a lot of these federal states sort of, they have histories that go back hundreds of years that make America look like little baby states in comparison. Is it, it's more like an empire. Like these states are more like, countries from around the, when you compare population and size. So it's just an outstanding achievement. It's easy to sneer at the sidelines when you're in a, country that's had, history's gone much easier or the population's significantly smaller. But I think they have to be commended in some degree.
Oh, no question. That's what's so exciting about this sort of advent of, a rise of an alternative to, because the Indian National Congress it seems like most of their selling point was like, we can kind of barely make it work. Mm-hmm. Was that like, we can barely keep this whole thing cobbled together. And the fact that they did so was a tremendous achievement. And for the BJP to come in here, and unfortunately, it seems like their main push was a sort of neoliberalism wrapped up with racism or bigotry. But it was still interesting, and I think a step forward for Indian democracy to put it on, to have a party that governed the country on a basis other than, we're just desperately trying to make this work, which was sort of what the Congress was. And then to have the Congress affiliated with a whole bunch of other parties to sort of come back, I think it's a testament to the success and enduring power of democracy. And we're a little short. Those testaments are in a little short supply nowadays. So it's really impressive to see.
Do you think there's much America could learn? Because just the fact we have so many parties, and yes, they tend to coalesce and then become one big party. At some point now, then you only really have two alternatives, but there's still a lot going on here. While, in some regards, it makes American politics, it seems a lot more democratic because there's just so much choice. Is this something you'd like to see in America in, say, 20, 30 years?
Yes, definitely. Do I think it's at all likely? No. I think so. I think, is it Maine, or there's one or two, I think it might just be Maine, or one or two states that allocate their electoral votes instead of winner take all. This is for the presidential elections. They say, okay, well, according to this percentage, we'll give one vote to the Republicans and two votes to the Democrats, or something along those lines. If more states did that, if ranked choice voting was more a thing, and really crucially, if this would require an absolutely massive, massive shift. Even I'm pretty bad at this. If people finally realize that actually it's their local politics that matter, mm-hmm. And that, people actually got invested in what was going on in their own states, cities, towns, municipalities, then I could possibly imagine something along those lines developing in the United States. But if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. Is that I don't see that change as particularly likely. But I think, yes, that you can make a pretty good case that India is more democratic than the United States now. I think you could make that case before this election, but this election really, really firms it up and really consolidates it. And I think it's a nice corrective to some of the simple-minded ways that I was thinking about India. And definitely the way that sort of the broader U.S. European commentariat was talking about India. It is a tremendously important cleavage in India that 72 to 79% of the country is Hindu. Muslims represent 13 to 15% of the Indian population. That sounds small, but when you keep in mind that we have a country of 1.4 billion, that puts
150 million.
Yeah.
For roughly half the American population.
Yeah, I was looking at it this morning and I saw like 4 different figures for how many Muslims are in India. It's like, is it 170 million? Is it 200 million? Whatever.
With so many people, it's hard to get exact figures.
So that makes them like India among the top 5 Muslim countries, or if not top 3. So what? I guess Nigeria, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So yeah, probably number 4, or perhaps I'm sure I'm forgetting something. So yeah, Indonesia. So 5th. And that's a cleavage that I think everybody has been focusing on really heavily because Modi himself has been focusing on that really heavily. Going back to his earlier career, I think Modi, for a period of time, was not allowed to travel into the United States.
Organize pogroms against Muslims?
Well, I wouldn't. I think that's a very strong statement.
Okay.
Very strong statement. What is indisputable is that he was the he was in charge in Gujarat in 2002 during what's known as the Gujarat riots that are reckoned to have killed as many as 2,000 people. And the question, I don't think he was on the street leading these pogroms. The general sense is that he, at the very least, did not do enough to stop them, might have tacitly endorsed them, and it was enough for the U.S. State Department to make it hard for him to, and I don't know the exact details, but I do recall that he had some low-level sanctions against him as somebody who liked to encourage ethnic violence. So so that was who Modi was. And this was always discussed as he came on the scene in 2014. But as someone who gets a lot of his news from The Economist, there was this excitement, though, because the BJP had successfully branded itself as, we're going to help dismantle Indian socialism, and we're going to privatize everything, and we're going to reform everything, and we're going to make things better. He became this standard bearer of economic success and economic liberalism. And what was interesting about 2019 is that his record was really, really mixed. He had undertaken, I think, is a monetization or a demonetization reform. I don't recall the details, but it was something that was perhaps a great idea, perhaps not such a great idea, but very haphazard in implementation and created a lot of suffering. I think it was a measure perhaps aimed at the black market or something along those lines. The economy had not done as well as had been expected or trumpeted, yet he perhaps, definitely in part because of the high level of disarray of the Congress Party and the lack of other opposition, he improved his margins in 2019. The story was that because, as you pointed out, Indian economy has looked really great over the past 2 or 3 years. Finally, it seemed like Modi's story was reaching fruition, that he was great on the economy. I think it's now clear after this election that that is not so true.
Okay.
That is not so true. I get a little nervous about the constant, whenever I'm about to post a video talking about some Chinese statistics, and I know that I'm going to get a dozen comments being like, you can't trust anything the Chinese say. It's all lies. And it's definitely been demonstrated, I think perhaps even more clearly than in the Chinese case, that there has been some really serious fuzzy math comes to the economic data that the BJP-run government has been putting out. That said, though, it makes me a bit, because you have to understand that all of these calculations are weird estimates. Mm-hmm. They're all, to actually say, for the U.S. gross domestic product, which I assume is a fairly, the gold standard or what have you. Should just stay away from saying gold standard in any context, but it is a very carefully put together measure. But that's just an estimate. It's just...
And also there's always fudging going on. You'll do certain things to make things look better. So every country's up to it, but some countries embellish a little bit more.
But I do think the consensus is that India, in particular, in recent years, has been something about GDP deflators or something along those lines. I don't know what any of that means, but apparently it's even more suspect. Okay. And I think
it's seen as a bit more artisanal than, say, China. It's harder to just go, oh, here's 17 massive factories. It kind of reminds me of the difference between Britain and France. Like France seemed to do the Industrial Revolution, but on a smaller scale and a little more at home and a little more personal. And that seems to be what India is, which then makes it harder to calculate.
That's a really, really good point. I know that the black market is a much bigger factor than it is in China. I know that the divisions, which hopefully we'll get to, just the very real divisions in India that go far, far beyond the simple question of religious affiliation are definitely factor in here, like political divisions. I think there's some states that are run by a communist party, which means that there's just a completely different approach to things.
They tend to be a bit more feminist, I think, as well.
Oh, more communist states. That wouldn't surprise me. So what's interesting in retrospect, part of what made this election cycle so terrifying, frankly, was the fact that Modi from the get-go was really hitting the bigotry aspect of his case really hard. And people were like, geez, So it's interesting because from the outside it looked like, gosh, he's won on the economy and he's consolidating the economy, and what he's choosing to do with this is get more bigoted against Muslims. This is terrifying. But actually, in retrospect, it kind of looks like maybe Modi and the BJP had a better sense than outside observers that perhaps their economic pitch wasn't so great, so they decided to double down on the bigotry. One of the errors that I made until this morning was I had sort of assumed that destruction of a mosque in Ayutthaya was the same thing as the Gujarati riots that Modi was overseeing, and that's not true. That's actually in a completely different province and in a different decade. However, with the beginning of his campaign in January of this year, Modi made the choice to associate himself with what happened in Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya is one of many historic capitals of India, has apparently got specific significance for the Hindu majority, relation to Rama or something. I have no understanding of Hinduism and would not pretend to have it. Regardless, very, very significant, as is often the case when Christians or Muslims take over an area. They choose significant religious sites to build their mosques or churches upon. And that happened in the 1500s in Ayutthaya. This tremendously significant Hindu temple was demolished, and the Muslim invaders in the 1500s built a mosque on top of it. Fast forward to 1992, which for whatever reasons appears to be a particularly fraught year in Indian intercommunal relationships. A mob of 150,000 rallied in Ayutthaya and tore that mosque down. Rather than make any kind of restitution or attempt to rebuild that, the BJP governments since have committed to building a Hindu temple on what was left of that mosque. So obviously, this is a somewhat tense issue in Indian politics, and Modi chose to open his presidential campaign with a speech at the opening of the new Hindu temple on top of the destroyed mosque. Your face tells the story. It is.
I've heard people compare him to Hitler. Do you think that's a bit extreme?
That's pretty extreme. Yeah, that is pretty extreme. And honestly, I to some extent like Hindutva or a sort of Indian nationalism that's a little more assertive. I think we talked about this years ago when we in our half-assed analysis of the RRR action film. It's understandable that there are Indians who are kind of like, I'm not so excited about Mahatma Gandhi. I'm not so excited about, it's great that, everybody in the West loves this guy who peacefully asked them to leave, and it's amazing that it worked. And we're not going to tear down statues of him or anything, but we'd like something a little more ballsy. Or what national? Ireland as close to an anti-colonial government as you can imagine, but it's still the Easter Rising, and there were
Indians that sort of seen what was happening in Ireland and were like, this is what we need to be doing.
Yeah, and there's a real urge in India for a more muscular, frankly, more violent independence tradition. This is why Subhas Chandra Bose, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing every letter, he's a figure who was prominent in the Indian National Congress, but instead of going on hunger strikes and doing civil disobedience during World War II, he said, I'm going to ally with the Japanese and we're going to kick out the British. And that is obviously less attractive to people in the United States and Europe.
Definitely.
The guy who wanted to ally with the Japanese Empire. But I can see why he is becoming a more attractive. So I think that there are elements of the BJP push of the Hindutva movement. Of course, I think Bose is distinct from the Hindutva movement, but I can understand why India wants, frankly, a more normal nationalism, a more normal national mythology. And I think the BJP kind of was providing that, or is attempting to provide that, is distinct from just a larger push, but was able to benefit from a larger push in that direction. So I have been more leery of the harder core, like, oh, Modi's Hitler. Is Modi a guy complicit in crimes against humanity? Yeah. Is he like a nasty guy? But like, I mean, this is sort of the same thing that comes up with a very, very different context in a much, much poorer country. But with sort of Abiy Ahmed, like Abiy Ahmed, the guy in charge of Ethiopia, is very credibly accused of being something of a genocidaire, going far beyond Modi, but also like he's working to consolidate Ethiopia, like a country in the global south, in ways that might, in the long term, be good for the country. So it's harder for me. I think I'm a little less willing to condemn him in such strong terms as saying he's a Hitler or what have you. Hitler was a loser. It's not yet clear to me that Modi that did incredible damage not just to Europe and the world at large, but to his own country. I'm not yet convinced that Modi is going to be a net negative for India once he's gone. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what plays out over the next 5-year period. Or, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure if the Indian context makes an allowance for earlier elections, but I assume that could be a possibility. What Modi now had, Modi is still vastly more likely, I think, is now the next Indian prime minister, but he's going to have to govern with non-BJP, non-Hindutva people in his government to get anything through the Congress. He's going to have to collaborate. He's going to have to refocus and move. I don't know. I mean, perhaps this means he's going to get even more vicious in his anti-Muslim rhetoric, but it's going to be harder for him to implement anything.
How does this opposition alliance, the India Party, differ to the BJP?
Well, that's a great question, and I think they've done a better job of establishing that they are something other than just not the BJP. I think the problem in 2019 was that's all they had to offer, was just not being the BJP. However, of course, another 5 years later, with the BJP having been in power for 10 years instead of just 5, perhaps their just not the BJP aspects of their appeal are more appealing. But I think the most interesting dynamic here is what happened in Uttar Pradesh. One analysis that I read of this that I find somewhat persuasive, and this goes back to demolishing the simplistic way that I was viewing Indian politics, because it's important to remember that it's not just Hindu versus Muslim. There are intense regional differences between Muslim populations. One of the interesting things about India, is my understanding, is the south is actually much richer, is sort of leaning...
the cities tend to be quite wealthier, while the north seems to have a lot of the population and more of the poverty.
But the south is certainly more urban and more traditionally. A lot of southern provinces are sort of getting towards middle income status, whereas in the north it's still very low income. And nothing is lower income than Uttar Pradesh. It's a province of 240 million people. So it is a province that is independently the fifth largest country in the world. So really the United States, China, and India itself are the only countries that are larger than Uttar Pradesh. It is the largest. Well, what's interesting is a lot of Indian history is in Uttar Pradesh. I think Ayutthaya is Uttar Pradesh. So it is the most populous, and I believe also the poorest of Indian provinces. And it is the traditional heartland of the BJP. It is a very strongly Hindu region, just by geography. I haven't looked at the history of this. I'd imagine it was a place that was more efficiently cleansed of Muslims than other places. You know, the great communications and logistical corridor of India, is it the Grand Trunk or something, sort of goes through Uttar Pradesh, I believe. So it was easier to send populations off to Pakistan or what have you. So this is the Hindu heartland, this is the BJP heartland, and Modi got absolutely slaughtered here. I think there were 80 BJP members in the 2019 election from Uttar Pradesh, and after this election there are 30.
Wow.
Just absolutely decimated in its heartland. And this is the point at which the Indian story gets a lot more complicated than naive Western observers like myself were giving it credit for. But I'm not sure if Congress was the big beneficiary in Uttar Pradesh. I think it was another party in the Congress's coalition that strongly emphasizes social justice. Strongly emphasizes for lack of a better word, redistribution. I don't think we'd use I don't think they'd use the socialism word anymore, but that's the pitch. Because despite the officially rampaging GDP figures of the Indian economy, I think after 10 years of Uttar Pradesh's experience of BJP government, their sense was not enough has changed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think some of the most outlandish differences in wealth I've ever seen was in India, where you see what looks like a normal skyscraper and you think, oh, that's for some big business or something, but it's one man's house. So he lives in the top half, his servants live in the middle, and the bottom is just his garage, and literally surrounding it is a shanty town.
Wow.
And I can't imagine a worse distribution of wealth, so I could definitely see a lot of people going, can't we just have a little bit of that? Because you are dealing with incredible poverty.
So there are dozens of competing narratives to explain what happened to Modi here, and all of them are probably true. But I think one of the most compelling ones is that, frankly, a lot of his historic supporters who are impoverished said, like, yeah, I hate the Muslims too, Modi, but what have you done for me lately? It's the economy, stupid. And despite the fact that the economy is supposedly doing so well, I'm not seeing any real benefit here. And I think that's probably the big thing. One of the cleavages, so Dalits, which I believe are traditionally the least favored in the caste systems. I think
the untouchables, are they the leather beaters?
I believe that's the term. Are a political force since the founding, since Indian independence. They have had their own party. They've been a political force, and they are guaranteed certain things. I believe in the Indian Constitution. I think there's a dynamic where a lot of some portion of untouchables have said, you know what, we're just not going to be Hindu anymore. We're going to be Buddhists because this, but I don't think that's a significant. I think probably most Dalits are still Hindu and would have been susceptible to pitches of, oh, it's the Muslims who are keeping you poor or whatever that the BJP was making, but that made the political calculus say, well, hey, wait a minute. If Modi gets 400 seats, then he can change the Constitution. And if he can change the Constitution, maybe actually this guy and the BJP and the sort of Hindu nationalist guys aren't going to be so friendly to us untouchables at the bottom here, and maybe we're going to lose some of our privileges. I think that, too, was another dynamic here. And that, I think, points to the most healthy and most inspiring aspect of what happened here is that it is, I think we've learned that the Indian voter is a lot smarter than we've given them credit for. I think people in en masse and individually were making the choice, hey, actually, this guy has been, doesn't need any more power. And that's a very democratic impulse. This guy needs to be taught a lesson, needs to be taken down a peg or two, even among people who...
Do you think there's the idea that India feel like they've moved so far forward that they can change direction and go with a different leader?
Yeah, that could be part of it too. And I think I think there's probably a somewhat, vaguely disrespectful, bigoted might overstate it, but just sort of opinion that like, oh, well, it's populism and all these poor people and they're just going to go with the strong man because that's what poor people do. Or And the Indian voter said, no, actually, we're significantly more sophisticated than that. And we're not going to play into this simplistic narrative that is really, frankly, a kind of anti-democratic narrative. So it's quite inspiring. I think wanted to look again at sort of the market reaction and how strange it's been. What's kind of interesting is that India has a very bewildering mix of sort of hyper-capitalist elements and old-school socialist elements. It was founded after independence. I think we talked about this a little bit with Somalia, with Yemen. There's this interesting dynamic. Perhaps it has something to do with what was going on in British politics or just a reaction to British politics. There's a lot of post-colonial British territories that used to be British colonies that went fervently socialist. So in that, and that was the ideology of the Congress Party from 1947 until the 1990s. They call it the license Raj, is the very pejorative way that it has been referred to, this idea that the empire of sort of socialism and red tape and this, that, and the other thing. Both the Congress Party and the BJP in this century have been quite strongly neoliberal in that they've been talking about cutting away red tape, cutting away bureaucracy. They're talking about privatization. And I think the sense of sort of the pro-business people looking in from the outside is that this has been an incomplete reform, that this has been sort of a failure, that the initial efforts under Manmohan Singh, the Congress leader, were successful. And to the extent that India's had any economic growth, it's because he was able to chip away at these things a little bit. And Modi's big promise was that he was going to just fully sweep it all away, and we're going to have the IMF poster child of an economy. And what's interesting is the market reaction to Modi losing was initially quite negative, because folks were deeply bothered by this disappearance of the Modi dream, that Modi was finally going to be able to do these sweeping reforms and finally get rid of all the socialist elements, and was going to connect the country so we could finally go be China, finally do what China did in the 2000s. And I think we're realizing that that's not really happening. And I think what might be possible, I'm not at all poo-pooing the idea that more economic reforms, even more neoliberal reforms, are almost certainly necessary in India. But I do think we're now reaching sort of the next economic era, where certainly in the United States and Europe, some would argue that China was ahead of us on this. The sort of globalization, free trade fundamentalism that made everybody want to sweep away the license Raj in India is kind of fading. And that, in fact, India, by holding on to so much of that FDR era, for lack of a better word, government involvement in the economy, might actually be kind of ahead of the game a little bit, might be more capable of...
Because I think the IMF is still very against a lot of those ideas. It kind of wants you to free up everything and remove as many rights as it can. So it can make things difficult for something like India if it's one to protect its populace.
Exactly. And I kind of wonder, I just get more and more obsessed with the U.S. military-industrial complex's complete failure to provide artillery rounds to Ukraine, which is, I think, one of the most glaring and humiliating things. But I feel like India, has a system in which if the government decided it was a priority to produce artillery rounds, would probably be able to produce artillery rounds, because they held on to the vestiges of, some state-owned enterprises, some bureaucracy.
But it's also possible the fact that maybe Modi never had that much power to remove those. It might be, a sign of India's strength that it's sort of a better all-rounder than while China has just one great asset that if it tips, then it's in a very bad situation.
Well, I think exactly. I think The Economist, perhaps the IMF, but sort of certainly U.S. and global business elites are pissed because we're never going to get the top-down China economic miracle that we got in the 2000s. But I think that you're exactly right that India, and they've certainly demonstrated on June 4th, that they might have strengths that are much more important for a long-term success of a polity and a democracy that China kind of desperately wants. I think, frankly, the fact that India has been able to be, whether those GDP figures are accurate or not, the fact that China has managed to be, it's only in comparison to China that India's economic experience this century is seen as anything other than a miracle. The fact that India can still have this vibrant, messy democracy and be putting up extraordinarily impressive economic figures is just a really, really hopeful sign. And especially, I mean, India's growing faster than China is now.
Oh, yeah.
And it's doing so as a democracy, whereas China is the economic laggard over the past 3 or 4 years and is run by this weird, like, throwback mid-20th century wannabe Mao. I feel pretty good about India, man. Like, which is not where I expected to be after this election.
But it might also have the geographical strengths in the sense of America's states. You know, the way you have your Californias, your Texases, your New Yorks. I feel like you're going to have that. You'll have a more, hopefully a better geographical distribution of different industries. Because it does seem to be, I know historically it was seen as, your country should specialize in one thing. But it appears that's completely wrong, because what if that one thing's not sold anymore? So India has quite a diverse economy. A lot of ICT, but it's doing a lot of agriculture. It does a lot of stones, petroleum, a wee bit refined petroleum, which is always a good one to get into. And I could see a lot of these industries just getting better and more diverse.
India has much more diverse centers of power and economic weight. I mean, it's all coast, whereas China has this sort of very, very profitable coast and then a bunch of internal areas that are subsidized to one degree or another. Certainly India has that too, but it's, all the way up. I mean, it's a lot more is coast than isn't. And they have, Uttar Pradesh, I suppose, is the part that is not coast.
But also it feels like it has a lot more potential for a much more diverse internal economy, which is another great asset that America has that I could see India just having, for centuries to come.
Yeah. I'm very optimistic about India right now.
Modi, maybe not the best person in the world, but things might move better, and hopefully he works with the other parties better to improve things for all Indians as well as the Muslims in India.
Well, the best thing is, thanks to the Indian electorate, Modi has no choice. He has to collaborate. Mm-hmm. He has to, and it's a victory for Indian democracy. It's quite nice to see.
And on that positive note, we would love to have you join us next time at the More Freedom Foundation podcast.
Huzzah.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.